Affirmative action policies are policies that are designed to help out minority groups who in the past have been discriminated against in trying to kind of forgive or I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for, but trying to fix some of the past problems. And the idea of redressing past discrimination and saying that, we're really sorry for kind of what we did in the past, but we're going to make sure that we fix it moving forward. And a good example of this is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. In 1968, they said that there could be no discrimination in housing practices. And what we ended up seeing was prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1968, African Americans, when they were brought into a certain area, when they were looking for a house, a real estate agent might point an African American family into a certain direction that maybe wasn't the nicest housing or the nicest area within a particular community, thus kind of creating this segregation even out in the suburbs and stuff. So the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was designed to kind of stop that point blank and say we're done with this sort of practice. An affirmative action policy moving forward would be sort of having a quota, as you can see later on this slide, sort of having a quota and saying that when we create this new neighborhood, we're going to make sure that X percentage of people coming into this neighborhood are African American or Hispanic or whatever. So the idea would be that we're going to fix this past discrimination by trying to move in a different direction. And instead of looking at the equality of opportunity, it's actually looking at the equality of results. And instead of saying, well, African Americans, women, they all have the chance to purchase a house or to get a job. We're saying, well, no, we're going to make sure that job happens to make up for that past discrimination. And it's very controversial because at times, especially when you're talking employment, people feel that race is the number one deciding factor for somebody getting a job or somebody getting into college or anything like that. And understanding the intent behind affirmative action, I think, is very important. We've talked in previous lectures how the NFL, you have to at least interview a minority candidate for a position whenever that position opens up. That does not mean that person has to get the job. Under affirmative action, it would mean that, one could mean that a couple percentage or whatever number percentage has to be a minority candidate within that particular organization. So affirmative action is trying to kind of change that idea, and it is very controversial because of the impact that it has on really everybody. And the big case to know for this, it's not necessarily a mandatory case, but it is one to pay attention to because I think it's interesting for what it outlines with affirmative action, but also kind of the impact that it has had on students and high school seniors, especially going into college, have brought up questions like this as well. But you had a gentleman by the last name of Backey who was trying to get into a medical school out at the University of California, and twice he was denied. He was 35 years old, and he was denied twice because they were reserving 16 spots for African Americans. So out of the 100 spots that were going in, 16% were going to African Americans, and he fully qualified for it, for the medical school. And this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and I think it's an interesting case because in the case, it was an 8-1 decision, and Thurgood Marshall, the first African American Supreme Court justice, actually ruled in favor of Backey. And they said that, quotas are something that are illegal or unconstitutional. Quotas of any kind for any race violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, in this case, they also said that race could be a factor, could be a single factor. It could not be the only factor in determining college admissions. So if two candidates for a scholarship or two candidates are for admission are equal, race could be a factor in how they pick, but it cannot be the only factor. So they cannot just say, well, we're going to pick 8 African American students to fulfill this quota. But they can say, well, we've got all these students that are equal. We're going to try and increase the diversity of our school so we can pick these African American students that are equal to these white students, and we're going to kind of try and increase the diversity through the acceptance of these minority groups into our colleges. So affirmative action has taken many roles. You're starting to see it a little bit more today with things like possibly slave reparations, or it's just trying to decrease the divide between groups. That's the incentive behind it. And as I said, it is a very controversial action that has been taken.